Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Plaw, Tech. And today we're going to be joined with a very special guest, James Brundage. We're going to hear about his journey to MS Build, his recent MVP status, and a whole bunch of awesome project updates and more. But first, let's talk about the pre-show. Well, this week that this is going up, I am currently at PAX 8 conference in Denver. So if you're at the conference, shoot me a DM and we can meet up and say hi. Check out the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ. Check out the PowerShell scripting channel. Shout out to Josh Hendricks. He'll be joining us, I believe, in the next 2 weeks. He's been super active there. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the way he uses PowerShell for cameras and all kinds of cool stuff. I want to shout out Daniel Schroeder's script template. There is a blog from Daniel Schroeder where he covers his script template that he uses with his scripts and some of the decisions behind some of the things you may see inside there. So very cool. Also, shout out to version 7.5.0 preview 3 of PowerShell. Bunch of cool new things in it and bunch of fixes. Two that I like are added a progress bar for remove item and expanded the tilde to $home on Windows with tab completion. I'm on Mac these days, but I do like the tilde reference of home. All right. Introducing to the podcast, friend. Known him for years at this point. Talked to him on the podcast a few times. James Brundage, Microsoft MVP. Congratulations on that. You are a former PowerShell team member, prolific module author. And I said this on Justin Grody's episode as well. I love highlighting the community efforts and how open source and encourages that and how we're all better together. But I think it's definitely worth shouting out those prolific module authors that are doing more than their fair share. So James, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. How's everything going today?
Good. We've been chatting for a while before we hit record here, but I want to hear about MS Build. I've never been to Build, and you were fortunate enough to go this year. Can you tell me a little bit about how that all happened and what it was like?
Yeah, let's see if I can pierce the veil a little bit. So I also had never been to Build this year or until this year. It's actually kind of been on my very small bucket list of things to do, conferences to kind of check out. Mainly because, over the years, in my PowerShell helpings out of various entities and groups, I keep getting drawn into helping out, some group with some stuff pre-build. And so I've always been, around it and aware that it's a thing, and yet never been to... I'm going to say it's kind of like a little bit of a nerd prom sort of thing. It's a very fun conference. Let's kind of back up a little bit. A few months ago, I was honored to be inducted into the Microsoft MVP program. The MVP program is a collaboration between Microsoft and outside individuals who've demonstrated technical and community excellence, and it's there to kind of help grow the community and help increase understanding of Microsoft products and give feedback to Microsoft where it counts. So it was a real honor to finally get into that in-group. I'm really happy to have gotten the nod.
That's huge, man. Congrats. That's big.
And if you know people that, might be deserving of a nod, I'm trying to find people, to nod in the direction of. So that, because I'm in Seattle and because Build, has some opportunities for MVPs to help out in proctoring, kind of gave me a chance to attend the conference. So I got to trade, oh, sure, I can help answer random PowerShell questions to a room of 70 or 80 people for attendance to this conference. And it was pretty fantastic. I got to keep saying Build was a blast. If you've felt that kind of PowerShell Summit energy, that's very vibrant and comparatively speaking, really small. The The vibe at Summit has, I think, a few thousand or a couple hundred people. Tops like 400 or 500 people. Build has 3,000 or 4,000 people.
That's a lot.
So I don't think those vibes scale linearly either. I think it's pretty exponential. So it was a lot of people to meet, a lot of stuff to hear about. Microsoft is doing a lot of amazing stuff with AI and making a co-pilot for about everything. And there was a lot of that front and center. So there was a lot of stuff to learn about. But like the same as, the PowerShell Summit, the real joy of these sorts of things are the friends you make along the way. The people you did not know you'd meet, the conversations you did not know you'd have, the tools you did not know existed until you ran into somebody that works with them or on them. It was great. So I'm happy to knock that one off the bucket list. I would strongly encourage anybody to go, to encourage their bosses to help, get them going there. It is definitely a good return on investment. Plus, there's certs you can get if you actually can find the time to attend a session and get certification, and lots of trainings and labs that you can learn from. So, yeah.
Hey.
Also, I've got a pile of stickers from this that would make Stephen Judd jealous.
Sign me up. You got me adding this to my bucket list now.
Yeah, so it was a fun one. I'm glad it lived up to its reputation, and that I had the chance to, get going.
Now, you mentioned AI a little bit, and I'm just wondering, you know a thing or two? Because a little birdie, Chrissy Lemaire, told me that you may know a thing or two about AI. Is it all right if I prod a little bit and see what I can glean from you?
You can prod a little bit. It's still like in the good, fun, nebulous territory. Chrissy and I have been discussing where we're going to find collaborative points of fun in AI. We both want to move there. It's just also, I'm trying to get through a few webification and security and containerization efforts first, so that I can do things securely enough and visually interestingly enough to make it all fun. Because, having AI is great, but having AI only in a prompt that, is purely text is a lot less fun.
I agree with that. Have you checked out Fine Tuna?
I am aware of it. I have checked it a little bit. It's an interesting project, but I don't know if I can really comment on it, especially considering maybe half an hour before this, I was actually asking Chrissy, could you re-explain these bits of embedding to me? And so as far as where I'm at in the journey, I understand a lot of the fundamentals of how AI works. I don't want to get into them because they're kind of very nerdy. But I get enough of them to kind of be troublesome. And I also understand essentially at a high level how OpenAPI and OpenAI play together, and OpenAPI is kind of a backbone of a lot of stuff being, presented in a RESTful format. So it's going to be not just the way OpenAI talks, but the way it tries to talk to a lot of things. And I can already talk to that very easily. So there's already a lot of dots that I can put together. I'm just kind of figuring out when's the right time to string together the AI dots into the chain.
So, without getting into any details, right? I'm keeping it surface level here. But how impressed are you with AI in general as a technology?
That's a loaded question.
I mean, is it cooler than
moderately?
Yeah.
This can get really deep, really accidentally fast. I don't think we've yet talked about a thing that happened to me mentally about 6 years ago that I call the I'm walking here epiphany. And it was epiphany about AI consciousness and thought process. And basically it's, I'm walking here because I'm not using up all my blood supply by walking here. I am a chemical computer. I have excess computing capacity at this moment, and my brain is free to wander. And maybe, just maybe, that might be a more fundamentally good basis for understanding consciousness and computation than correlative engines, which are most AI. So I'm interested in the topic on a lot of levels. I'm very impressed with what correlative engines have gotten to, what generative AI has gotten to. I just also still don't quite think it thinks the way we think. And until it can think the way that we think, there's going to be problems in this space.
Yeah.
So,
and I think the public impression, like the general audience that's not IT or understands things, thinks it is like basically a brain. Or at least earlier on when ChatGPT was rolling out, it seemed like there was a lot of that impression with the general audience of them thinking it's like, oh, we have actual intelligence.
Yeah, I think that's actually a question that's way above any of our pay grades because, if you really look at this question at all, it becomes like, metaphysical. It's like, what is consciousness? What is intelligence? At what point is there a dividing line between sentience and not? And in fact, like, this is a fascinating topic to get into. I don't want it to become the main event here, but like, one of the side effects of that whole I'm walking here epiphany is that if you basically say that some form of consciousness can exist in whatever excess computing capacity a life form has, well, a lot of life forms probably aren't using up all of their energy at a given moment. I'm not saying like, a bug or a carrot has our level of intellect, but if you're accepting that framework, you might be accepting that a bug or a carrot has some degree of consciousness. It's just what the heck that looks like to a human. Good luck figuring it out. This is a reminder here. We're on the PowerShell podcast here to talk about PowerShell things, not about metaphysics, right?
That is right. So I will say that it's a cool space to watch. I love projects like FineTuno, but there's some cool practical applications. I think Doug Fink has some cool chat bots that he's used with ChatGPT for helping with regex and a bunch of other cool things that have been getting some good feedback. But, I think you're right. We're getting a little out of the box. Let's containerize the conversation and talk a little bit about Docker. You might know a thing or two, right?
Yeah. And if you did get a chance to attend this talk I gave at the PowerShell Summit about rocking Docker with PowerShell, one of the things that I kept coming back to is, look, I'm only like ankle deep, maybe knee deep into this. There's still so much I have to learn. But let's start from a different perspective here and, ask, what do you know about Docker? Like, set the listeners up.
So I'll say I know that it's some kind of containerization thing, and I think all kinds of people are using it. It's not just super fancy devs. It's a pretty helpful tool, but we'll say that that's where our working knowledge is.
All right. That's a fair working knowledge. All right. So Docker is a containerization thing. Yes. For what the hell that means, in case, that's not clear to everybody listening. The easiest way to think of containers, although people might get a little bit, ornery in comments, is containers are basically VMs. They're not exactly VMs because there's like not actually a box.
Yeah.
But they're basically saying, here is everything of a self-contained operating system. And they're generally kind of, more self-contained like set of files. They're generally built in these layers. So you'll be able to basically say, I want to start from this point and then just customize the operating system like so. Okay. And there happens to be a layer for PowerShell. So you can have a Docker file that is like from mcr.microsoft.com/PowerShell. And that's kind of it. You've got your basic like PowerShell image there. You could tell it to install a couple modules by using the run command. And then you'll have a PowerShell box with whatever modules you want and literally nothing else. And you can get multiple different OS flavors, but your default's going to be Linux, which, like a number of things, can help with making sure your modules work in a kind of cross-platform environment. But it's really, from a practical perspective, it's a game breaker in terms of security and the way that we think about PowerShell. Because if you run a PowerShell script from the internet on your box, you might be in deep trouble. If you run a PowerShell script from the internet in a container, in a VM, with no private information exposed from the VM and no network connections into your LAN, I don't know how much trouble you could really be in. And the opposite is true too. Like if you are hosting like PowerShell in sort of a web context in a Docker container, and there's no passwords that you're keeping in this container, I don't really have to care as much if you break into it, because there's nothing that you gain.
Yeah.
It's not that it completely eliminates the risk of code injection, or that you don't need to worry about it at all, but it definitely significantly reduces the reward of code injection, especially if you consider that, like, normally Docker containers are run in something like a Kubernetes cluster, and these will like automatically restart them if they die and if they exceed different conditions or health check failures. So you can basically have a box that's like, okay, congratulations, you hacked me, and you'll lose that connection in like a minute. Good job,
Yeah. So that sounds like it could be helpful.
A lot of stuff.
It could be helpful for both someone just developing, having a dedicated box. Hey, here's what you need to develop on this module, but also in the testing phase of things, the fact that you can use different versions of things, you could use it in like a CI/CD pipeline a little bit to help with things.
Yeah, in fact, actually, it's a good thing to bring up, because one of the other things to understand about Docker is that it's kind of quietly everywhere. Basically, modern CI/CD exists atop Docker, whether you think about it or not. But the default runners in GitHub workflows and GitHub or in Azure pipelines, Azure DevOps pipelines, are both basically built by the same team, by the same set of scripts, and are Docker images. So what they're doing every time they run your workflow, they're spinning up a container using this Docker base image that they have, basically saying this is a GitHub workflow runner or Azure DevOps pipelines runner. And that's where your scripts will run. And again, like if they pwned your scripts and your infrastructure, they wouldn't pwn all of Microsoft.
Right.
So it limits the exposure considerably. Like the worst that can happen in those sorts of scenarios is the virtual machine runs too long, basically. And if you're really thinking about this at the scale of like a Microsoft or something like that, I want to know and kind of don't want to know how many thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of Docker containers are coming to life and dying every day for this sort of thing. So like this is just incredibly common. It's literally happening all the time across the world, underneath all the different parts of the web that you don't think about or see. The whole microservice concept is basically built on this. It's basically saying, hey, instead of running all of my website all in one place, could I just run these tiny 5 spots at this one RESTful endpoint and maybe secure access with CORS, which would prevent you from like running the stuff from a web page in most contexts.
Okay.
So,
and is that usually like Kubernetes is like the layer on top?
Kubernetes is usually the layer on top, and Kubernetes is supported in every major cloud.
Yeah.
So like you can basically create a Docker image, deploy it to a Kubernetes cloud in Azure, in Amazon, in Google Compute, in Linode, in whatever other smaller competitor I'm not remembering right now. I'm sure there are other bigger ones that I'm also forgetting. It's very universal because it's a great answer to a lot of collective problems, and it's sort of centralizing some of the security implications of potential failures. Like if somebody can break out of the Docker container, Like if they know some zero-day exploit to Docker, that's Docker's problem, not mine. Like it might impact me, it might affect me, but like from my own security modeling perspective and my own technical effort, that's not my problem to worry about. And that's a big, big problem to take off of my plate, because I don't know, there are a lot of people who do PowerShell and IT, and a lot of PowerShell and IT, especially in like old VM management, was like all about making sure you had your images at the perfect state and being able to pave them at a moment's notice. So like this gives you that in a can. That's a much nicer, better way to do it than everybody trying to do it on top of 5 or 6 different virtualization platforms with 500 or 600 or 1,000 different ways of configuring it.
Yeah. And I'll say that if you've never heard of Kubernetes or Docker, or these seem out of the question of things you could learn, I'd say Docker is a great way to get started. It's not as hard as you think. You can get some familiarity with it and sort of demystify one of those terms you probably hear a lot and maybe haven't dove into. I know there's a lot of people out there that might be in that boat. And also there's a lot of jobs for Kubernetes and Docker deployments, and there's a lot of work to be done in there that are pretty good compensation too, if you're looking forward in your career to some other options.
One other thing to kind of note on this topic, because I kind of buried the lead a little bit, is Talk was rocking Docker with PowerShell, and there is this module I came out with for this purpose. It's called Rocker. You can install module Rocker, github.com/start automating Rocker. Easy module to use. It does the same thing that UGit does for Git, where it intercepts the application so that you can actually have rich objects coming back. It just does this for everything Docker. And it gives you tab completion, so you can just tab your way through all these obscure Docker parameters that you never wanted to remember. You can also pass it hash tables to like map ports and environment variables, and you can pass it script blocks to just run stuff. So you can really like one-liner your way to basically setting up like a little microservice in PowerShell. And,
I mean,
yeah,
from what I'm hearing, it's an instant download if you're using Docker and PowerShell. Instant. Just tab completion. Boom, you're done. But there's more on top of that, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's always more on top of that. Like I think I'm in the bell and whistle creation business sometimes. But yeah, once I've done a more effective, like thorough marrying of the PowerShell and Docker ecosystems, things are going to get really, really, really cool. Because at the end of the day, your module with a small amount of metadata can become an isolated site or service, and could be quite a nice one. And without that metadata, you can just have a really nice web experience around your module. I make a lot of modules. I don't want to be basically in the business of having to hand tweak the display of each one of them that much. I want to be able to have a rich educational experience around every module I build without driving myself insane, or at least any more insane than I naturally am. So, anyway.
Awesome.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to where that all goes.
Yeah, it's cool. You could pipe commands together as well. Seems like I enjoy that usability space of PowerShell, where we've accepted it as a tool. We're using it every single day. And guess what? We're using it every single day. So things like this that improve that experience and make it better is, to me, what it's not all about, but it's one of my favorite things about having access to community modules and not just being locked into what you have on your box, and having access to things like PS Readline that can enhance your experience, and Rocker. So I'll have links to everything you mentioned about Rocker in the show notes, but install module Rocker, kind of simple.
Yeah, it is. And also kind of easy to remember. And, I even have a drum kick and an animated logo if you go looking for it. So, yeah, really trying to rock it here.
You're trying to rock it.
Too hard, but
I mean, I will give you credit. Your modules have some of the best names.
I do try.
I can tell. It shows. It looks good.
One of the points I keep coming back to throughout my, career is modules are brands.
Yep.
Basically, the name you pick for a module will have a lot of implications about how people think of that module, including you, and what fits in that module, what doesn't fit in that module. That is or is not what's on brand for that module. It's a really good way to think about modules almost first and foremost as brands. Secondarily as like, okay, what's in this branded box, right? So if I have a brand like Rocker, well, I probably want to have something cool in it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, modules are brands. They can be very flexible brands. They can be very constrained brands, but rebranding is almost always going to be kind of expensive in terms of people's mind share. Like I've got a couple of modules that were renamed over time, and it generally takes like a half decade for people to start remembering to use the new one or making the connection. So it's a little unfortunate.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier, the webification of some of your projects. So I imagine that means taking your modules and giving them sort of a web interface.
Yeah, you have basic input, no script blocks. That's secure enough to manage in a web context, and it's potentially useful depending on the thing. Like I would actually kind of almost challenge you to kind of imagine what commands aren't potentially useful to run in a web context. And I think that the answer is there are definitely some, but the vast majority of commands could be used quite happily as a clickable form, or could see their output, quite happily as PowerShell objects rendered in a web page, right? Like, I don't think that the average user cares. And in fact, I think like to the degree that we care and are stuck on, no, the only way to use PowerShell is through the command line, we're kind of missing the point of what a lot of other languages do and how they operate, right? So it has generally been my view that PowerShell is a great language because it has great structure. Like if you're going a little bit old-timey with it, it's got good bones. It's got really, really good bones of command and parameter metadata. And that gives me enough to basically say fairly cohesively, what parameters do you take? What types are they? Are those secure enough types to handle? And for those cases that they're not, to kind of try to offer some bridging, like, all right, well, maybe I can let you provide me a JSON object for that, and maybe that'll work, So all the problems related to taking PowerShell command metadata and mapping it to a user context are very solvable. And I'm not just talking necessarily web in this context, but like any user interactivity can be built very easily on top of the command metadata that exists. Because in addition to all the command metadata that's there, all the stuff like help that gives you kind of like surrounding documentation experiences, there's also attributes. And you can have attributes for basically anything you want. So you can have open-ended extra metadata to render in whatever ways you see fit and in whatever context you see fit. Web is just the most easy and obvious of that. But because PowerShell's got those good fundamental bones, and because there's a lot of people that have kind of come up through PowerShell and built really useful things that are somewhat limited in their global utility based off of them being command line only, opening up the door to being able to take anything we build in PowerShell and turn it into web like that is big, at least in my book. It's
I think so.
Putting way too many words around this, but basically I want to be able to take whatever scripts that I or anybody else has, put them online as a web service for free, or put them online as a SaaS that you rent or buy piecemeal, and see what that does for us all.
Cool.
So yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah, I found that when it comes to doing business process stuff, it's very helpful when you can deliver someone something other than just a script that they have to run.
Yeah, that is unfortunately where I found this out painfully over my career as well. I've had a few projects where the script only produced errors if something went wrong, and therefore produced no output, because good PowerShell, right? At least good PowerShell for the time.
Yeah.
And it just never clicked onto management. Like, okay, so why aren't we seeing green? Until I literally started returning, a thumbs up object essentially. So, okay, here's your summary object, which shows that nothing failed, and we're going to show it in green with, a formatter and some right host. Now, do you believe me? It works. So, yeah, you got to have a human face around PowerShell a lot of the time. It adds the value exponentially, or it adds to the value exponentially.
I agree, and always a good chance to shout out import Excel. Having some kind of output other than PowerShell to share is helpful, and it's kind of an easy win for some of your things. But I want to pivot to easy out. Oh, by the way, did you get to run into Doug at Build? I believe he was there.
I don't think Doug was there at Build. If he was, I did not run into him.
I thought he did something with AI recently. Maybe I'm mistaken. But I know there was a bunch of AI at Build.
I would have loved to run into him, but I do not know how often Doug leaves Manhattan.
That is a good question. How's your user group been going? You want to give that a little plug?
Well, depending on when this airs, the 12th, we should have Dan Schroeder on to talk about PowerShell tips.
I plugged his blog earlier. I love that guy. Last episode, I was wearing his shirt.
Well, I mean, like, I basically asked for a blurb beforehand, and like the moment you plugged him, I sent him a message. Hey, you already got the plug anyway, man. You're good.
Nice.
So yeah, we got that coming up in a couple weeks. It's just been kind of plodding along, slowly gathering some steam. Just trying to keep it booked month after month and find fun things to talk about and make sure that I don't always end up on the hot seat and having to talk about something fun and interesting. But no, we've had, let's see, Steve Judd and I did a talk the previous month. That was a case sensitivity training that came out of a quick little jokey conversation at the summit and turned into a really, really good, quick presentation we'll both be able to give again. But it basically covers where PowerShell's case insensitiveness is not quite enough, and various other things are case sensitive in ways that are out of your control, which is a thing that will continue to bite you in PowerShell, whether you want it to or not. So that was fun, doing more of those sorts of things. Looking for a few more beginner talks before I go kind of back into the fun deep end, which probably should be in the next couple months. We also had Bruce Pad on a couple months back talking Braid. I talked PipeScript a few months back after implicit interpretation first dropped. Have we talked about that? We should for a bit. Implicit interpretation and PipeScript in particular.
I have no clue what implicit interpretation. Let me guess. You are like inferring how you handle the types when you're doing your transpiling.
Close enough, but not quite.
I said some big words though. I got to give myself a pat on the back.
You said some big words. Implicit interpretation, which is a big pair of words, is what it says. It's basically saying, hey, I know that a Python file has an interpreter of Python and a JavaScript file has an interpreter of Node. So when you go to run blah.py in PowerShell, when PipeScript is loaded, it will look to see, do I have a language defined and an interpreter defined for this file? And it will implicitly interpret that file. You can implicitly run 17 other languages and counting inside of PowerShell, including basically everything you've ever wanted to or been told to play with, like Node, Lua, Python, and a lot of things that you might not have been told to play with that are kind of newer and cutting edge, like Crystal and Wren. So yeah, anything that has an interpreter, it's really easy to wire up. If you just go ahead and declare a language in PipeScript, you're basically declaring a property bag. As long as that has a file pattern and an interpreter, you are good to go. And thus, a whole other bunch of the linguistic universe kind of falls under PowerShell's sway. Yay for us. So,
okay. Let me break this down just a little bit.
Okay.
So, we get PipeScript installed on our machines, right? That's step one. We got to have it there.
Yes.
And then say we want to run some Java stuff. Do we have to manually register with PipeScript saying like, hey, I do have Python, and
if you have Python installed and PipeScript isn't installed and imported, it will just magically do it.
Okay. And what is it using for that, if I may ask?
It's literally just saying, like, I know I can call Python. It's literally saying, here's this file you're going to go run.
Yeah.
Okay. And the arguments you're going to pass to it and the inputs you're going to pass to it. Go run Python. It's not getting into rewriting Python at all, or JavaScript or any of them. It's just giving you that bridge. And it's also taking any objects that are more complicated than a string or a primitive and turning them into JSON as you send them. So if I go and call, like, you know, whatever Python with a huge array of objects, they're going to become JSON on the way in, and then Python can deal with them in a uniform fashion.
Okay, so you could write your PowerShell, but still call Python and use PowerShell data structures as well.
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
And then your Python would be able to come back with strings or JSON, and there you go.
Sweet.
So, like, if you have a team member that's like, I don't care to learn your PowerShell stuff, but I really want to use my statistics module in Python to go and crunch the numbers on this data, you can be like, okay, buddy, we got you. Go ahead, write me your Python script. Give me, work off of a JSON object that you're getting supplied as a parameter, or any number of JSON objects that you're being supplied as a parameter. Congratulations, you're done.
Okay, that's pretty sick. I do have a question technically, though. Are you just checking the path to see if Python exists? What is PipeScript using?
Don't even need to care about the path, because it is literally just the name of a command or a script block. So if it's the name of a command, if I say you're a Python script and the interpreter is Python or Python 3, right? If the command's not found and you run blah.python, you're going to get a command not found error saying, I basically couldn't run this because I couldn't resolve Python because there was no Python. And otherwise, it'll just run Python.
Okay, that makes sense. So it will defer to whatever's on the box.
Yep. And back to that whole Docker thing, if I'm creating a constrained operating system and you completely control what's on the box, I don't have to worry about the extra exposure that I don't opt into or choose. Oh, I do also get a security benefit, though, because in case this part isn't clear, you're normally running this out of process. So your PowerShell script is running Node or Python. It's running and returning. So if your Node or Python were to crash and burn, it wouldn't be able to impact your PowerShell state, which is kind of nice. They also shouldn't be able to impact, like, environmentally pollute your context, because PowerShell, infamously does not allow that sort of stuff to happen. Like, you can't, have a command that you run that changes environmental variables and have them be picked up by the PowerShell run space above you. So,
okay.
Yeah, it actually ends up kind of perversely being a little bit more secure, even though it sounds like it would be less secure. And also, theoretically, you can have a security boundary at either layer, and you do have events generated as this is happening. So you could be tracing, oh, this is what's going on. But you could have PowerShell basically be saying, I won't run script blocks that aren't shaped like this. And you could, at least in theory, have some Python that says the same sort of thing. So, yeah, it's a really, really overpowered, really simple, really useful feature. And all it really is basically plugging the right 2 lines of metadata per language into the right place in PowerShell, which incidentally has been there, I think, since V2. It might have been since V1. It might have been since V3. The thing that's letting this work is pre-command lookup. There's a callback that's called in PowerShell before every command actually is called or resolved. So what you can actually do is, in that moment that it's asking, does blah.py exist? You can actually say, yes, it does. And it's actually called invoke interpreter.
Oh, okay.
Or it's actually now an alias to invoke interpreter. and then there you go.
Okay.
For those that have been following the brain-breaking magic tricks career here, there's a thing you can do in PowerShell called smart aliasing, which is basically when you have a function that can act differently depending on the name it's called with. So you can have any number of aliases mapped to that function, resolve them back into any number of objects while only exposing a single command. So that trick is very overpowered.
Whew, we got a lot of tricks today. I have a question because I'm looking.
Just
looks
one.
like you got. Oh, I have many, but you have 68 languages, which means that's like a lot of files. So what was your process for doing that? Were you just like one evening, like, all right, we're adding 68 languages, here we go? Or how did you decide on that list? What was it like? Because they each have their own PS1 file.
Well, to mix metaphors and memes here, one does not, walk into Mordor or eat an elephant one bite at a time. So it's really honestly been like sort of chopping away at it. In fact, like the language's structure is pretty recently changed into something more simple and sane. But basically, for any of the given languages, it's always been trying to map a few pieces of information to the things that PipeScript is trying to do with that language. So it's just been trying to find the right answer for that problem over time while you fill in more of the details you'll need. At a really high level, the other part of PipeScript and any given language works by kind of figuring out where you can embed PowerShell into that language. And most of the time that's in comments. So it's like for any given language, it's like, okay, what comment form plus a little bit of extra stuff do I want to indicate means the start of PipeScript code and the end of PipeScript code? That's the other key piece of information I'm storing about every language. I could store a lot more information about any given language. They're open-ended contracts. So the way that I'm approaching it now is much less like that I have to eat the elephant all at once, but more like I can just add a piece of information here, a piece of information there, a new definition here, decide on a new sort of thing to add, and then add the pieces of information to each language that I can support it in and repeat the process ad infinitum. Maybe with a little bit of help in Copilot if it, proves helpful.
Well,
so
it definitely seems like a very interesting and fun project. You should certainly check it out. Very helpful and useful as well. Especially, I can't imagine if you're in a situation where you're trying to use PowerShell and some people on your team are writing Python, and that sounds like a bit of a mess, but that seems like it's made simpler by your module.
It is made simpler. It is a bit of a common mess because anytime you run into any teams that are any degree of cross-disciplinary, multiple languages are involved. And that's kind of one of the other keys to understanding what I'm trying to do with PipeScript and modern programming. You don't really build anything in just one language anymore. Like even if we're doing PowerShell, it's PowerShell and a bit of JSON, or PowerShell and a bit of CliXML if we're being that lazy to store stuff. But like you've got to have at least a little bit of like a data language to keep state and a regular Turing complete language to orchestrate things. And that's just to start. If you're really accepting the way most applications are built, you have specialties in multiple language disciplines that are all doing their own thing with their own tool bases. So like our tool chains, like you'll have web designers that work their way and backend developers in multiple different parts of a company dealing with multiple different languages, doing things their way. And we as PowerShell people have a choice. We can either basically swim against that tide or equal with all of the other currents in it. Like, oh, but we're the PowerShell people. Here, we are yet another language you could choose to use. Or we can play to our strengths of orchestration and we can be like, we're the PowerShell people. We're the people that can actually wrangle all of these languages together. And that's what PipeScript is trying to do written mass or en masse for everything. Like, just give us a good way to describe it enough that we can use it in PowerShell and do fun stuff.
I love it. So check it out. Install module PipeScript. What is easy out? I know you covered it last time, but maybe some people haven't heard. What is easy out and how can we get it installed?
I think you've already keyed on how you get it installed. It's install module anything. Install module easy out in this case.
That's right.
Before somebody accidentally installs the module anything. Anyway, so easy out is actually the oldest module. Like, it was actually written originally as kind of a thought experiment, an experiment of packages at the time they were called. And it was one that kind of came out the door with me and, got maintained for many years outside of Microsoft. And it allows you to write types and format files in PowerShell. And these are the ways that format files are the ways you display stuff. Like if you wanted to have stuff lay out in a table, or even more fancily in a custom control, aka any way you'd like. If you want to colorize stuff, those are format files. Types files are the ways that you extend objects, like you create script properties and script methods with types files if you want. So easy out helps you write both of these, which are otherwise, if you've ever even looked, they're really, really horrible XML formats that no one should ever want to learn.
I agree with that.
Which actually does bring me back to one recurring theme of why I do module development, why modules are great. I do module development so I don't have to resuffer through things that I've had to suffer through once, and so that I can save other people from that pain too. So easy out was like, here is this part of PowerShell that's really, really powerful, but that you'd have to suffer through. If I can remove the suffering, then I can just keep using that power. And easy out removes that suffering, lets you use that power. And I have at this point been using it for 15 years. It's been on Gallery since there was a Gallery, basically.
Wow.
It is one of a few modules that it's used in almost every other module I produce, because it basically compiles a types and a formats file for me, and that makes it easy and makes my PowerShell modules all easier to use and a little bit slicker for it.
Sweet. Sounds like an easy win. I definitely agree. Those format files are a pain. I did it for one project and I decided quickly after I would never do it again. And just for some context, right? So people might be familiar with PS custom objects. It's like a cool object you can use and output in PowerShell, which is, we want our functions outputting some kind of object, ideally. And this allows you to create custom types and then have formatting files for those types. So it's not just a PS custom object, it's whatever you call it. And you can display it in the best possible way without having to get your hands deep in some pretty nasty XML.
Yeah, it's pretty damn useful.
All right.
I got one more crazy fun one for the road here, though.
Let's do it.
Because it's a very recent realization that I'm very much enjoying. Part one of this is that there are a lot of spots within HTML and XML where easy out types and format files could live inertly. That is to say, I could throw them into a web page. The web page naturally would not care or render it. Okay? Now, two, there are a lot of scenarios in web where those would actually be really useful and handy. Like if I wanted to just alias properties, well, I've got a thing that'll do that in an easy out, and I could go and try to figure out a whole JavaScript library to describe that thing and a format to go and describe that thing, or I could just use, the note property definition and be done with it. And I can easily coalesce those inside of JavaScript. So I can basically take types and format files, at least in theory, and webify them. And because, say, the script methods you're running inside of a types file are more likely to be constrained, it's more likely to be translatable. So if I have a script method that's add these three properties together, that's pretty easy to translate into other languages. If I have a script methods like call these 50 commands and pipe them all together with these 5 other exotic ones, that might be a little bit harder. But 80-20 principle, Praetorius principle, Praetori principle, the idea that if I'm getting the more common case, I'm getting a lot of good. So I should be able to actually take all the stuff that I've been doing for 15 years now with Easy Out and make all of that very naturally work in a Webby context. And so format files will very literally become format files for web, which is just going to be so crazy and fun. And probably a little bit game breaking for everybody, because that'll basically mean that like old school terminal output and actual Webby output don't really have a difference anymore. And that's nice.
Wow. You've broken my game. You've broken my brain.
I try.
I have a challenge for you. I want to try something new I've never done before.
Uh-oh.
Would you like to play the one-word association game? So I will say something, and you will respond with one word.
This sounds like it's going to get me into trouble. I don't know.
Oh, it's nothing bad. I'm not. Worst case, you can just say cool if you think I'm leading you astray.
I'm going to go full Abed here.
And you can name modules if you want to. And if you say anything too bad, we can cut it. Okay?
That's what they all say.
PowerShell relaxation.
I thought you were going to throw me one word.
No, you throw me one word. It's a challenge.
Okay. I mean, I'm not going to throw you one word back. I'm going to throw you little phrases back then, if we're doing it this way.
Okay, little phrases. Fair enough.
PowerShell relaxation is fun projects.
Challenging tasks.
I'm going to add the little jingle to this one. Everybody hates math.
So it's math. It's not documentation. Okay.
Like, I mean, like documentation, I don't like it either. Like, generally speaking, it's not like the best of all qualities unless you're dealing with some good Microsoft stuff. And even then, it's like, maybe a 6 out of 10. But I don't know. Like, I think that even as many things as I've eventually conquered every time that I'm like looking at like a couple of new formulas for the first time, it's like, oh, how am I going to turn that into code? The symbols are hard. They make my brain hurt.
Best module ever.
A small phrase. TBD.
Fair. PowerShell community.
Go for some Douglas Adams channeling here. Mostly awesome and mostly harmless.
Favorite command.
I mean, get help. Probably.
Favorite innovation.
I'm just going to go for the sarcasm points here and say sliced bread, even though I literally have no sliced bread in my home.
I don't either. I was just given a loaf that is not sliced. But awesome, man. Well, you passed the challenge. You passed it. That was my first time doing one word association. And I want to thank you for joining us today. And thank you everyone out there at home for listening. It's been another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. We're everywhere. Check us out on the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ. James, dude, my brain is a sponge and it's full now. So thank you for filling my brain with PowerShell goodness. I appreciate it.
Anytime, man. We should do this more often because otherwise, the sponge overfills.
That's right, man. And where can people find your user group? I'll have a link in the show notes.
So you can just look for Pacific PowerShell User Group on Meetup. And you can also find me at github.com/startautomating or on various socials at Mr. PowerShell or on Twitter at James Brundage. Still not calling it X.
I think a lot of people are on that bandwagon. Awesome. Well, I'll have links to your stuff in the show notes. Check them out. Have a great day and drive safe if you're driving out there.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.